This group is pretty sharp and knows a lot about Alamo history, so how was I going to make it interesting? Because you guys probably forgot more about Alamo history. And so when I was researching the book, and let me make it clear, Beverly Lane wrote the book. I just did a lot of the research. She is the author of the Alamo history book. All right, Beverly. When I was researching it, and the reason the book came about is we were deep in COVID shutdowns and I couldn't travel or anything, and Beverly couldn't either. So she would send me a question to research, and about 4 hours later I would resurface and go, oh my goodness, I haven't eaten or drunk anything all day, and I've just been so busy looking at old newspaper articles and things about Alamo, and I found a bunch of really interesting people that lived in Alamo in the old days, and I thought maybe I would tell you guys about those people I found. I called it Scoundrels and Heroes of Alamo, and these are the people that didn't make it into the book. Next slide. But first, I'm going to pay tribute. Virgie is definitely a hero. I'm going to pay tribute to two wonderful women that you guys all know pretty well. Virgie Jones is the original Alamo historian. She wrote several books about Alamo. She lived in Alamo from 1948 till her death in 2010. She started coming to Alamo, though, in 1937. And there were still several pioneers in town, and the children were pioneers, and she would interview them. So when she wrote her books, she could write very meaningfully about Alamo. She did everything she did without the internet, which is just like amazing to me today. I can't even imagine being able to do that. And one thing I needed to remember when researching Alamo history was always to start with Virgie. She didn't necessarily always get the story correct. It was more important to her to tell a good story. But she always had a grain of truth to every story, and you always have to start with that if you're going to research Alamo history. So hats off to Virgie, who really wrote it all down and helped us take care of Alamo history. The next slide needs no introduction. I'm sure you all know Betty Dunlap. What was that? The only person I'm going to talk about tonight who lived her entire life in Alamo, a descendant of both pioneer families, the Humbergs and the Stones, and a cousin of the Joneses. Betty was so generous with her time. She made it such a priority to preserve the history of the San Ramon Valley. It's to her that we largely owe what memories we have preserved of Alamo. She was a major source for our historic Tales of Alamo book. She was a founder and a supporter of the Museum of the San Ramon Valley, and she was a fount of knowledge about Alamo. I can't resist telling you a story of how sharp Betty was to the very end. Beverly had asked me if I would research the street names in Alamo. That was a super fun project. I really enjoyed that. And I was stumped by Ursilia Trail, which was the street that Betty lived on. Couldn't find an Ursilia that lived in Alamo anywhere. So I go over to Betty's and I ask Betty, who was Ursilia of Ursilia Trail? Without skipping a beat, Betty says she was a daughter of Miranda. Now, mind you, this was the year 2020. Miranda was a rancher at Alamo in the year 1860. This was 160 years later. So I go to the census, and sure enough, Miranda has a 3-year-old daughter named Ursilia. And Ursilia was 3 in 1860, and the family was still there in 1870. But Ursilia was not there with her brothers and sisters. Perhaps she passed away, and there was a trail to her grave, and that was the name. But there was definitely an Ursilia of the Miranda family, and that was the origin of the street, and that was because of Betty. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to go to our scoundrels. This scoundrel is actually in the book, but I don't think we really went into detail about how truly evil this gentleman was and how much of an impact he had on the Bay Area. He was a brilliant man, you have to give him that. He was valedictorian of his class at Columbia University. He arrived in San Francisco in 1849 with the first wave of the gold rushers. He ran for state senate within 6 months of arriving there at the age of 25. He didn't win, but he went on to run for several other offices. He met many people that helped him get a bill passed that incorporated Oakland in 1854. Before that, Oakland was known as Contra Costa. That was the name of its post office. That was what the U.S. Post Office called it, and then he incorporated it and called it Oakland. And he was the first mayor of Oakland. He talked the city council into giving him control of the Oakland waterfront, and even in those days was worth tens of millions of dollars, the money he took out of Oakland. A gentleman named Domingo Peralta was the heir to the San Antonio land grant, which was most of Oakland, Berkeley, even into Orinda. He cheated Domingo Peralta into signing over his San Antonio land grant upon the pretense that he was just signing a power of attorney. He then turned his gaze upon the San Ramon Valley. He told the land grant heirs of the Rancho San Ramon he would represent them in their claims with the land quits. But since they had no money, they paid him in land. They ended up losing all of it to this gentleman. He never lived in Alamo. At one point, though, he owned every property in Alamo. If you researched your deed, if I researched my deed, it would show that Horace W. Carpenter owned my property in the year 1864. Next slide. A little hard to see. This is the original map plat that was approved by the courts when Horace W. Carpenter made his claim. And it was said in newspapers at the time that it looked like a spider, and he had put out little fingers to take in all the good valleys. This is roughly Green Valley, that's Tice Valley, Sycamore Valley, to give you a little, this here is about Alamo Cafe, and down to the border with San Ramon, which was the Amador Ranch in San Ramon. He didn't have a claim there. And in the book, there is the plat of what was the final claim, and the names are on it of all the pioneers of Alamo. They had purchased their land in good faith from the original Mexican land grant owners. And because Horace W. Carpenter achieved the title through devious means, they had to buy the land over again. That is the origin story of Alamo. The pioneers that came, that bought land in good faith, and then they had to buy it all over again. $90,000 in gold was the total that the early settlers like Jones and Stone and Thurston and Smith and Bollinger all had to pay all over again for the land. So he is definitely a scoundrel. We call Horace W. Carpenter. He left California in 1880. There's a story that he was on the Moraga Rancho and somebody threatened his life because that he left Moraga in a wagon with some hay on top. He was hiding and went back to New York and never came to California again. He left an estate valued in millions. He did not have any children. He left at all the colleges. He did leave some to the University of California, Berkeley. He left a lot to Columbia University and the Barnard College in New York. That is the first mayor of Oakland and the land grant swindler. Next slide. So here we come to another real swindler, a true resident of Alamo. The man's name was John Aldebert Benson. Virgie wrote about him because his house still exists in Alamo, but she didn't know his first name. She just wrote Mr. Benson, and she said he was an enormous man, over 300 pounds. He was too big to fit into any bathtub at his house, and he bathed in the decorative fountain in the front of his house. That's Virgie's story. He registered to vote in Alamo in 1892, and in those days you had to put your height down. He was over 6 feet tall. He was certainly a very large man. He started out as a surveyor, and he was an honest surveyor, and as he took on more and more surveying jobs, he realized how easy it would be to cheat. California was a big, wide open area at the time, huge timberlands and valuable ranch lands, and he started his grafts, his cheating by doing fictitious surveys. Like he was paid by the government to survey a piece of land, never sent anybody out there, and just made it up the hills, made up the boundaries, made up, etc. And he ended up doing swindles, and it's a little complicated. I had to try to figure out how this swindle kind of worked, but he had over 40 people in what he called a syndicate. If you look it up on the Wikipedia page, it says the Benson Syndicate was the largest organized crime syndicate in America. And he had over 40 people. They bribed government employees. They bribed surveyors. They went down to the Barbary Coast waterfront in San Francisco, where a lot of transients hung out, got them to sign their name to a piece of paper claiming government land, and that was because you had to sign that you were only acting for yourself and not for anybody else. And then as soon as the land was assigned to the transient, they had them sign it back to them. All told, he swindled millions of dollars. The government didn't like this. They pursued him for 30 years. One article I found said the U.S. government spent over $400,000 trying to put John Benson in jail. They took at one point hundreds of witnesses to Washington, D.C. and put them in hotels for 3 months to testify at his trial. He had better lawyers. He put a lot of his money into lawyers, and he escaped all the indictments for 30 years. In 1890, he bought 800 acres on the west side of Alamo and built a large home, and he registered to vote in Alamo. So I count him as an Alamo resident, because from that point onward, for the next 20 years, he lived at the Alamo House, although he had 2 magnificent mansions in San Francisco. He had fallen out with his first wife, and in 1903 he got married again without bothering to get divorced from the first wife. And his second wife was actually very famous at the time because she had been a dance hall girl in the Klondike gold fields, and she had been married to a man called Sweetwater Bill. And Sweetwater Bill was famous all over America for being a Klondike gold millionaire. And for her second husband, she married John Benson, who was already married to his first wife. The first wife lived in a beautiful mansion in San Francisco, and the second wife lived in a beautiful mansion in San Francisco on Lombard Street, at the top of the crookedest street in the world. And in 1909, the government finally caught up with John Adalbert Benson, but he was only sentenced to a year in jail at the Alameda County Jail in Oakland. He was set to be released on May 8, 1910. Grace, his second wife, the Klondike dance hall girl, took his car from his ranch in Alamo, drove to Oakland, picked him up, turned around, they drove back into Costa County. And the story goes, they stopped at the Harlan Ranch, which was in South Walnut Creek, just north of Alamo. He got a drink of water from the ranchers, exchanged some words with him, walked back to the car and fell dead of a heart attack on the day he was released from jail. Never spent another free night since he had gone to jail. When he died, this was just tabloid fodder all over America. I found hundreds of notices that John Benson of Alamo had died newspapers in North Dakota and Ohio and everything because he was such a famous criminal, because he died on the day he got out of jail, because he died in the arms of the Klondike beauty. And then the two wives argued over his estate. He had never bothered to divorce the first wife, so she had the better claim. However, there was no money left. The Alamo house was heavily mortgaged. The San Francisco houses were heavily mortgaged. It had all gone to pay lawyers. So next slide. This is a picture of his house from 1983 from one of Virgie's books. It's halfway up the West Side Hills in Alamo. And Virgie had interviewed a woman that lived there after John Benson lived there. Every floor is 3 stories tall, opened out to beautiful gardens, and had incredible views of Mount Diablo from every room. Next slide. This is how the house looks today. So not very original, but you can still see this very distinctive X railing on all the balconies. It's still 3-4 stories high. And if the picture we had was from the front, this still has this thing, but all of this has been added on. It's now 13,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms and bathrooms, and it sold for $5 million in January of 2021.
That's off of what street?
What's it in the south?
The address is now South Avenue. The original address was Lark Lane. And the original address was 800 acres, and it was in the middle, and there was no address.
The Nahas's old house.
It's Nahas's old house, so we know a gentleman that owned that house for 20 years, and he was a builder, and he tried to restore it to its original appearance, and he told me he thinks the house had been remodeled 6 or 7 times already, so it was really, really difficult to do that.
He said it was haunted too.
I'm sure it was. It's one of the oldest houses in Alamo. I believe it was built around 1890. So that's John Benson. Let's see. My next gentleman wasn't a scoundrel. He was Judge W.W. Cope. He was the 6th Chief Justice of California. Did you know that? We had people that were Supreme Court justices that lived in Alamo. He was born in Kentucky in 1824. He was one of those people that came to California to make his fortune in 1850. That's sort of a recurring thing. However, he had already been trained as a lawyer when he came. He found mining very hard work, so he returned to legal work. In 1858, he was elected to the Assembly from Amador County as a Lecompton Democrat. I had no idea what that meant, so I looked it up. A Lecompton Democrat was a Democrat who was pro-slavery and had advocated for slavery to remain legal in America. And the other kind of Democrat was like a Stephen Douglas Democrat. You were anti-slavery. In 1859, he was persuaded to run. He was already a Assemblyman. He was persuaded to run for Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. He was elected, and he took office only a week later, early, because his predecessor resigned in order to fight a duel with a U.S. senator, in which the U.S. senator Broderick was killed. And this is a pretty famous incident in early California history. It was still pretty much the Wild Wild West, and things like that happened. In 1863, he became California's 6th Chief Justice when Lincoln appointed one of his fellow justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. He served as Supreme Court Justice for a year. And in one of the cases that came before him, he ruled against Horace W. Carpentier. So I guess he was kind of a hero that way. But it still lost because he was on the dissenting side, not on the winning side. He was instrumental in forming the California State Bar Association and was the first president of the San Francisco Bar. In 1884, he bought property on Green Valley Road from the Stone family. He planted orchards and retired to life as a gentleman farmer. He died in San Francisco in 1903. So his Alamo, I put 1890 there when I did the first thing, but I later found a reference that he actually bought the orchard in 1884, but he wasn't registered to vote in Alamo till then. Next slide. This is from Cocoa History, and they say the residences in this picture. I could only see a barn and the orchards. And we know from the census that it was on Green Valley Road. Much of his property became Whitegate and Grand Ranch in modern day Alamo. No trace of the home remains. It was probably a very large home because in the census he had 5 servants living in the house. Next picture. I hope you can see this. This is also from Cocoa History. This is he probably knew August Hemme. They were prominent people. They had both lived in San Francisco and were prominent people in San Francisco. So this is a picture that Cocoa History has captioned of the Cope family at August Hemme's house in the background. He had 7 children, and I counted there's 7 children and then extra in the picture. So maybe an in-law or something. That's Judge Cope, another prominent Alamo person. Next slide. This is Captain John Hackett. He didn't come in the 49-50 gold rush because he was born in 49 in Canada. But he first sign of him is in Oakland in the 1870s, and he is a pilot on the bay, a pilot on a ship going back and forth. His first job, ferry boats. Very important, lucrative business, ferry boats back and forth between Oakland and San Francisco. No bridges, no roads, just ferry boats going back and forth. At one point, he acquired a dredging machine, and that is how he made his fortune. He dredged much of the Oakland waterfront. He dredged much of West Oakland, which was marsh at the time, and turned it into usable land, and he dredged and created Lake Merritt. He was so much in demand as a dredger captain that he was also hired by Honolulu to create Honolulu Harbor, which is what he's mostly known for. In the 1880s, he ran for city council in Oakland and was elected. He also at one point ran for Oakland mayor. That's a theme of 3 of the people I'm talking about today that lived in Alamo ran for Oakland mayor. But by 1905, he had made his fortune and he retired to Alamo. He bought 200 acres. He had always been interested in horses and horse racing. And he had a stable of racehorses. His most famous racehorse was Yellowtail. Yellowtail won a ton of races and then retired to stud at the Alamo farm. And he built a beautiful home. And he whimsically called his home the Anchorage, because that is where a retired sea captain would live, right? He would haul anchor, whatever the word, drop anchor, and that was where. So in 1910, he went to El Paso to watch his horses race and dropped dead of a heart attack. And his home still exists, though. Next slide. Oh, no, excuse me. He became a very good citizen. Next slide. He adopted the San Ramon Valley as his second home. He didn't live in Oakland anymore. He was one of the founders of the San Ramon Valley Bank. So this picture also from Cocoa History. He was the president of the San Ramon Valley Bank. This is August of 1907, the first day of business of the San Ramon Valley Bank in Walnut Creek. He was the president. A.H. Cope, that was Judge Cope's son, was the vice president, and was the first bank in the San Ramon Valley when they opened a Danville branch. Next slide. This is the house John Hackett built in Alamo in 1905. This is the picture was taken in around 1920, and you can see If you know nautical homes, the detail, this is called a widow's walk. This is supposedly where the widow would walk to see her sea captain come from the sea, and it has this side porch. And the next picture, this is how it looks today. You can't really tell, but the widow's walk is gone and the side porch is gone, but it's largely original. It's a beautiful home. I was very glad the owner invited me to come see it. He was very happy. I researched the history of his home. I found all the owners. I found who built it. He only been told it was built by a sea captain. And he's kept it very original. He only added a big family room off the back. It is right next to the Iron Horse Trail. And when I first found the notice about John Hackett's home, I said, well, it can't be this home. It says it has this beautiful view. And then I asked him about it, and he goes, well, it did have a view before all the trees grew up. So, an interesting part about this property is it also has a 1935 Sears Roebuck catalog cottage on the property. I wasn't able to see it because he had a tenant, but I would love to see that. Presumably, it came in pieces on the train, and they just took the pieces off and put it together right on the property.
And what street is that on?
It's on Lunada Lane, the Lunada Lane that is upper off of Hillgrave. And you know, there's 3 Lunada Lanes in Alamo. That is the original Lunada Lane, that street up there. Okay, next we come to Frederick Stratton. Frederick Stratton was a native of Oakland. He's the first person I'm talking about that didn't come from somewhere else. And he built a house in Alamo in 1907, and he lived there till his death in 1915. He was a graduate of the University of California and Hastings College of the Law. He was a very prominent attorney. Among his other cases, he was one of the U.S. attorneys that prosecuted John Benson in the land fraud cases. He was very active in Republican politics. He was elected a state senator from Oakland in 1896. His biggest accomplishment was sponsoring the legislation that established the primary election procedures in California. In 1901, President McKinley appointed him collector of the ports in San Francisco. I'm not sure if we have this position today. At the time, it was an enormously important job. If you were the collector of the ports, you were in charge of collecting revenue from all the ports on the Central Coast. Upon the assassination of President McKinley, when Theodore Roosevelt became president, Stratton was twice offered cabinet positions by Roosevelt, but he turned them down as it would have meant moving to Washington, D.C. with his young family. His position was renewed by President Taft in 1909, but when President Wilson, a Democrat, was elected in 1912, he retired as the collector of ports. He had become enormously wealthy from his lawyer work and from being the collector of ports. I imagine there's ways to make money if you're in charge of all the revenue from the ports. In about 1906, when the huge Hemme Ranch was beginning to be subdivided after the death and bankruptcy of August Hemme, he bought 30 acres at the end of Hemme Avenue in Alamo and built a farmhouse, which still exists. He used this as his country home until his death in 1915. From this enormous position of power and wealth, Frederick Stratton spiraled down it, kind of like John Benson did too. His wife died in 1913, leaving him with 2 small children to raise. He lost his position as collector of ports. He ran for district judge, although endorsed by every major newspaper, he narrowly lost. He then declared that he was running for Oakland mayor, becoming the 3rd of the people I'm talking about tonight to run for Oakland mayor. But the following strange incident meant he dropped out of that race. He became engaged to Erminia Peralta Dargy. She was the widow of William Dargy, the founder of the Oakland Tribune, and twice a wealthy woman. She was the great-granddaughter of the Domingo Peralta, defrauded by Horace Carpentier. But her branch of the family managed to hold on to their land, principally centered around San Leandro. They also owned a land grant rancho of thousands of acres in Santa Barbara. Her wedding to Frederick Stratton was announced in all the papers. A marriage license was obtained, and the wedding was to take place at Arminia's Oakland mansion on a Friday night in April 1915. The wedding guests had assembled, the groom was ready with the license in his pocket, and Arminia never showed. Later it was revealed she had sent a note to Frederick saying that as a devout Catholic she could not marry during Lent, as it was not appropriate. Whatever the reason, he was humiliated in front of his friends and colleagues and immediately suffered a nervous breakdown. He entered a sanatorium in Livermore. That was the term they used in those days. He stayed there until November 30th, 1915. Being judged well enough to return to his life, he was released on that day. He was driving his car from Livermore to his home in Alamo. He stopped and bought a revolver in Pleasanton. On the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks in Pleasanton, he pulled over and shot himself on the same day he left the sanatorium. Like John Benson before him, his death was a sensation and front page news all over California. The prominent, wealthy politician, the broken wedding to a famous member of an early California family, the nervous breakdown, the death by suicide on the day he was released. The wealthy man with a mansion in Oakland and a ranch in Alamo. It was tabloid fodder for several weeks. Next slide. So this is the house he built. It's actually, of all the houses that I'm talking about today, fairly modest. It was one story. I only know about this house because Beverly and I were signing Alamo books, and this guy walks up to me and goes, "My house is over 100 years old." And I had a lot of people that were telling me that, and then I would research it, and their house wasn't over 100 years old. But this guy had newspaper articles that came out of his walls that were from 1907. So I researched his house, and sure enough, this was the house that Frederick Stratton built, and it still exists on La Sonoma Way in Alamo. It's a little difficult. Wait a minute, next slide. The owner of the house also gave me this photograph that he got when he bought his house. It's a little difficult to see. The photographer is standing on the eastern ridge line over Alamo. This is Hemi Avenue. This is the Hemi Railroad Station, the Southern Pacific Station. This is all orchards, and this would be Rancho Romero School in future. This is that house, and it had the tall element. It had a tank house, as most farmhouses had in those days, a house with a water tank on top. Those of you that know Alamo well, back here in these trees was the Westminster Retreat House, which is a very large historic house. And you can see this is the railroad tracks and this is the boulevard. And I was glad to see when I got this picture from the owner of the Frederick Stratton house. Next slide. You're probably wondering when I was going to talk about a woman, so now I'm going to talk about Cornelia Stratton Parker. She was Frederick Stratton's daughter. I don't have a good picture of her. This is a picture of her book, which is still in print. It's still a bestseller. It's very popular. She wrote it about the life of her husband. That person pictured there is her husband, who was a UC Berkeley professor. And he unfortunately died during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. That was the central sorrow of her life. She never remarried. But from January to November of 1915, she lived in that little house in Alamo. And this book mentions her life in Alamo. She mentions Alamo 7 times in the book, and it's not always, she doesn't always say Alamo, but you can tell she talks about her husband. Mind you, he worked in Berkeley, It's 1915. The Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern Railway had been built in 1914, traveled down the boulevard. There was a Hemi station stop. He would take the train from Berkeley and Oakland to Alamo, take it down the boulevard, get off the Hemi stop, and walk down the lane, and she would meet him there. And she talks about how on her birthday, they took the train to Danville and had ice cream, and I thought that was just very charming. It's a very small book, but it's still in print because of the picture it paints of life in 1915, and because of her husband's biography. He was a famous labor relations professor. He was called on to go into a volatile labor situation and investigate, like, were the workers being treated well or whatever, and he would try to escalate the tensions and things like that. He did that work in Europe too. They traveled in Europe. So Cornelia is, even though she only lived in Alamo for a year, I think she went on to a great career as a writer. She wrote for all the big magazines on the East Coast. She lived in New York and Martha's Vineyard. She wrote for Harper. She wrote for the Atlantic. She never remarried. And she never wrote about her father killing himself on the side of the road when his marriage went badly. I just thought that was so odd. Anyway, next slide. The final person I'm going to talk about is Abigail Smith Timmy. And her beautiful house still exists too. And she wasn't particularly famous or anything, but she lived in Alamo for 50 years. And her life is a good example of what life in Alamo in the 40s and 50s were. She was born into a very poor family in Michigan, and her parents died while she was a teenager, and she needed to support her younger brother and sister. So she decided to take a secretarial class at the local college, and she got a good job as a secretary and was able to support her family. She had increasingly more responsible jobs until she ended up in Washington, D.C. During World War I, she was secretary to Bernard Baruch's assistant. Bernard Baruch was a wealthy Wall Street financier, an advisor to President Wilson, and the chairman of the War Industries Board during World War I. The War Industries Board was responsible for rounding up all the war supplies and material that they would need for World War I. In that job, she met many famous people, congressmen, senators, cabinet members, and by the mid-20s, she had left Washington and she worked in Chicago for Ernst Timmy. He was a director of the Continental Casualty Company, one of the largest insurance companies in America. He had been recently widowed. She had never married, and she was 39 years old. She married Ernst, and she became wealthy overnight. They traveled to California together in 1936 and fell in love with the San Ramon Valley. They bought 20 acres of the old Benson estate on the west side of Alamo and built a fabulous mansion, which still exists. They were active in the Red Cross. They served as directors and fundraisers. They were active in Republican politics. They served as precinct chairs. Abigail built fabulous gardens. All the articles about her say that. She gave fabulous parties that were written up in the papers. She was president of the Diablo Garden Club, served on many other local committees. In 1976, Virgie visited Abby Timmy, saw her beautiful home, and listened to Abby tell the story of her dog named Lark, who waited for her at the gate to the home's driveway. This is the origin of the street names Lark Court, Lark Place, and Lark Drive, which exist in Alamo today on the acreage owned by the Timmys. Ernst died in 1956 and Abby died in 1986, having lived in Alamo for 50 years. She inherited $2 million when Ernst died, which was an incredible fortune for those days. She left all her money to the very obscure State Michigan University, where she had gone to secretarial college, 60 years before. And they have all her papers, and they have an index online. They have plans of the Alamo house. They have pictures of the Alamo house, pictures of the Alamo gardens, da, da, da. I've written them, I've called them, and I haven't gotten anybody to return my calls or my emails yet. I would love, but probably nobody in Michigan cares about the plans to her Alamo house or her Alamo gardens, but I would love, love, love to see them. And at this Michigan State University, Ferris State University, everything on the entire campus is named for her. There's the Timmy Center for Student Success, and the Timmy this and the Timmy that. So I thought she was worth writing about, mostly because her house still exists. It was remodeled extensively. This is the entrance. I believe it's largely original because it just doesn't look like a house you would build today. It's now a 12,000 square foot house with a 13-car garage. It sold for $9 million in 2022. Next slide. So this is probably the most iconic symbol of Alamo, the Alamo hay and grain. And I showed you pictures of all those titans of the old days. They were lawyers and ship captains and swindlers and judges and things, and all became very wealthy and bought big properties in Alamo. And now we have tech titans and Silicon Valley titans that come to Alamo and buy property. And 3 years ago, a tech titan bought the Alamo hay and grain, and he also bought the building that was Cherubini's, now called Lever Coffee. And no one really knows what he's gonna do with it. So we're all just kind of waiting to see what's gonna happen. Is Alamo gonna change any further?
Isn't he also the one who bought the Timmy house?
No, but he lives on Lark Place. He lives right below.
Oh, okay.
He bought a house on Lark Place
Close.
for $5 million and kind of tore it down and now put a ton of money into it, and now it's worth more.
Thanks.
So that's my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Nancy?
You had a picture up there very briefly, and I think you said it was the Hemming House.
Yes.
Is
Yes.
that the one that's the den downtown in Danville?
No, the Hemme House was a beautiful mansion. We only have 2 pictures of it. August Hemme built it in 1876. It was often called the finest mansion in Contra Costa County. It burned down around 1905, 1906. Nothing remains from it. It was at the location, it was on the east side of the boulevard at the location of Deodore Lane now,
Oh, yeah.
between the creek and the boulevard.
I know where that is. Apparently they divided pieces of that house up and they lived in part of it. I knew somebody who lived in a piece of it.
Yeah, there's some old historic, there's a property there, it still has a tank house, one of the 2 remaining tank houses in Alamo. And there's people that also say they find pieces of the Hemme estate all the time, pieces of fireplaces and things
Yeah.
like that.
I have one other question. Do you know the den downtown in Danville? Was that a house, somebody's home that got moved there, or was it there?
I don't know what you're talking about, the den?
Yeah, that's the name of it now. It's a beautiful old, like Italian-esque Victorian. It's on
Huh.
the corner and. House? Could be.
Yeah. Let me explain to you, I am an Alamo expert. My expertise ends at Wayne Avenue. I don't know anything about Danville and San Ramon.
I'll ask them, I'll give them.
Steve?
Do you have any plans to publish any of this, a monologue or something?
Oh, I don't know. Christian recorded it. I don't even know if anyone thinks this is interesting. These people, I was just fascinated reading about this. This guy was a bigamist and went to jail and swindled millions of dollars, and he lived in Alamo.
Is there any interesting historical background of the land of his Bryan Ranch?
I think part of it was Judge Cope's estate, but I don't know anything else about it. Lou.
When can we expect the next walking tour of Alamo?
Oh, and I get asked that all the time, and I want to do them I want to do like one a weekday, and then the next month do one a weekend, and I just haven't got to it yet. And truthfully, I can only handle about 12 people at one time, but, so what Lou's talking about is we were doing tours of downtown Alamo that Beverly wrote a tour, and Betty helped write. Betty wrote a whole thing out of what Alamo looked like in 1930s from her memory, what building was where. And, you know, sadly, Alamo doesn't have much of that stuff yet, so we mostly stand in front of something and show people a picture of what it used to look like. But we've since added a few things, like we found out doing the book, Beverly and I found out the location of the 3-story air watch tower that Alamo had during World War II, where everybody in Alamo signed up for a shift and spent 2 hours looking at the sky with binoculars in case an attack came from the sky like Pearl Harbor. And that site is very close to downtown, so I've added that to the tour.
And
Yes, sir?
a footnote, very young Professor Lawrence Humphreys. She had a World War I uniform, father tags, field artillery gloves, Miss Lewis. We donated them to the Veteran Memorial.
Oh, wow.
Exhibit.
Oh, wow.
Just inside.
Very cool. First time I ever met Betty, she asked me to meet her at Cherubini's, which was her family home when she was a little girl. And I sat there absolutely fascinated. She's telling me that's my mom and dad's bedroom. That was my sister's bedroom. And then there was a picture of her dad up on the wall, which the new owner still has there. And she took a picture of her dad off the wall and said, that was the sadness of her life, that her dad died when she was 15, I think. And she kissed the picture and said, Daddy. You know, that was what Cherubini's meant to Betty. I thought she was a neat lady.
Where does the name Cherubini come from?
Oh, it was the owner during most of the time that we remembered it. She had the antique store, and she had a lot of seraphs and cherubs and things, and she just named it after that. If you were ever there, she had, you know, cherubs up in the wall and stuff. Luke.
What was Cherubini's before it was Cherubini's?
It was a lumber store and a hardware store. Oh, are you asking to see if I know? Oh, is that what you're
I
doing?
have no doubt.
So Lou Plummer, who grew up in Alamo, and his friend Stu Buttery, who grew up in Alamo, like to show up at my tours and ask me trick questions.
We know you know.
Used to be Alamo Lumber and Fence.
That's right. Yeah.
I worked
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. More of that story.
Yep, the exact thing. I delivered all the lumber. Then you're bored.
So thank you.
Yeah.